Recall that through our work in the previous video and our work on the congruent triangles posters, we've determined that in order to prove that two triangles are congruent to each other, we do not need to necessarily show that all pairs of sides are congruent and that all pairs of angles are congruent, but rather we can employ some strategies and some shortcuts, and that's what we're going to use today. The first of these shortcuts, side, 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 says that when three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of a second triangle, the two triangles are themselves congruent. We can employ side angle side, in which two pairs of sides in the included angle in one triangle are congruent to two pairs of sides in the included angle in the second triangle. The triangles are congruent. And the third shortcut we could possibly employ is this angle side angle, which says that when two pairs of angles in the included side of one triangle are congruent to two pairs of angles in the included side of a second triangle, the two triangles are congruent. It's very important that as we approach a proof, we mark the given information in the diagram first. The diagram is kind of like the roadmap, or think about your outline in an English essay that we're going to use to tell us exactly what we're going to write about in a proof. And all too often, kids will sit down to start to write without having that outline, without having that plan, and that's where they encounter real difficulties in the proofwriting process. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the given information, and I'm going to mark the given information in the diagram. So our first piece of given information says that segment AR is perpendicular to segment CB. So the word perpendicular means forms right angles. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those two segments perpendicular in my diagram. So AR is that vertical segment. It's perpendicular to or makes right angles with CB, the horizontal segment. And I marked my diagram with right angles where those two segments intersect. So I've gone ahead and I've marked that given in my diagram. The second given says that segment AR bisects angle CAB. So when we bisect an angle, that means we make two congruent angles of it. So the first thing I have to do is go find angle CAB. Angle CAB is that one right there at the top of the triangle. And the fact that segment AR bisects that angle means that two congruent angles are formed. So now I've marked that one in my picture as well. So in looking at and examining the diagram, I've got a pair of congruent angles up at the top of my diagram. I've got a pair of congruent angles which are formed by those perpendicular lines down at point R. So I have two pairs of congruent angles. And I happen to notice that the sides that are in between the green angles and the purple angles, side AR in the triangle on the left and side AR in the triangle on the right, are going to be congruent to each other through the reflexive property, therefore making my triangles congruent by angle side angle. So when I actually sit down to write this proof, I'm going to discuss or write about two pairs of congruent angles, one pair of included congruent sides. So the two angles I'm going to write about, I'm going to write about angle 1 being congruent to angle 2, the angles at the top of my picture. And I'm going to write about angle 3 being congruent to angle 4 down at the bottom of my diagram. And the pair of congruent sides that I'm going to need to discuss in my picture, side AR congruent to itself. So here's everything that I'm going to need to discuss or need to write about in my proof in order to show or to demonstrate that these two triangles are congruent to each other. All right, so I want to discuss angle 1 being congruent to angle 2. I knew those two guys were congruent because of the angle bisector. So I'm going to get this proof off the ground by writing about that angle bisector. So I'm going to start by discussing the fact that segment AR bisects angle CAB. I know that's a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. And because of that angle bisector, I was able to conclude that angles 1 and 2 are congruent. And I'm going to put a little A in parentheses right there just to, as a reminder to myself that those guys are a pair of angles or congruent angles in the triangles I'm trying to prove congruent. So as far as a reason goes, an angle bisector forms or makes two congruent angles. All right, so I've talked or discussed about my first pair of congruent angles. The second thing that I need to discuss in this proof is the pair of congruent sides, AR congruent to itself. Well, that's just through the use of the reflexive property, which says any geometric figure is congruent to itself. And since that's my pair of congruent sides, I'm going to put a little S there. And I know that's a true statement because of the reflexive property. And the last pair of congruent figures I need to discuss in order to make these two triangles congruent is the fact that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. I knew these two guys were congruent because of the first original given that gave me the perpendicular lines. So I'm going to start out by discussing the perpendicular lines. Segment AR is perpendicular to segment CB. I know that's a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. And anytime you have perpendicular lines, they form congruent right angles. So I'm going to go ahead and say angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. And as for a reason why those two are congruent, well, my perpendicular lines make those congruent right angles. And that's the second pair of congruent angles, so I'm going to put a little A in parentheses there. So at this point, now that I've talked about one pair of congruent angles, two pairs of congruent angles, a pair of congruent included sides, I can go ahead and pull all three of those together and use angle side angle to prove that triangle ACR has to be congruent to triangle ABR. And I'm simply going to use for my reason angle side angle. I can't emphasize enough the importance of using this roadmap. This tells you exactly what you need to write about in your proof. And it's very important that you utilize the diagram to come up with the outline and then the outline to come up with the proof. All too often I look at kids or I see kids that say, I don't know what to write. And the reason kids don't know what to write is because they neglect to mark the diagram or they fail to come up with an outline. The diagram and the outline is really the foundation, the structure for everything that you're going to discuss in your proof. All right, so with that in mind, why don't you take a minute, pause the video, and go mark the given information in your diagram. All right, let's see what you come up with here. The first given says T is the midpoint of segment PQ. So segment PQ is that blue one right there. And because T is the midpoint, we know midpoint splits it into two congruent segments, making segment PT congruent to segment TQ. Because PQ bisects segment RS is this red fella right here, bisects makes two congruent segments. So I want to indicate that those two are congruent to each other, but not necessarily to the ones formed by the blue segment. And then lastly, we're given that segment RQ is congruent to segment SP. And again, I want to indicate that those two are congruent to each other, but not to the two sets of segments that were given previously. So looking at this picture, I see a couple different approaches that we could use in order to prove these two triangles congruent. We could use side, 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 or if you wanted to use the vertical angles at point T, you could also use side angle side. So you might choose to write your proof with side angle side using the given or the vertical angles at T. I might choose to write my proof side, 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 and we're both correct. So there may be multiple methods. I'm going to choose to go with side, side, side. So this is the strategy that I'm going to employ. The three pairs of congruent sides that I want to discuss in my proof are PT and TQ, side RT and side ST, and lastly side PS and side RQ. So these are the three things that I'm going to have to discuss in my proof before I can conclude that those two triangles are congruent by using side, side, side. So the first one, PT and TQ, I got those due to the fact that T is the midpoint of segment PQ. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that. And I think maybe this time I'll do statements and reasons, just for all you two-column proof people out there. So I know that's a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. And because T is the midpoint of PQ, that's what tells me that segment PT and segment TQ are congruent. And they're my first pair of congruent sides, so I'm going to indicate that with an S in parentheses. And the midpoint makes or forms, however you want to say it, two congruent segments. I'll cite statement 1 because statement 1 was where I first originally talked about that midpoint. All right, so I've talked about these. The next pair I want to discuss are RT and ST, and I got those two congruent because of the segment bisector. So my next move is going to be go right about the segment bisector. So segment PQ bisects segment RS. I know that's a true statement because it's given to me to be a true statement. And through the use of the segment bisector, I was able to determine that segment RT and segment ST are congruent. And they're a second pair of congruent sides, so I'm going to indicate that with an S. And I'm going to say bisector, and I can cite statement 3 because that's where I had the segment bisector, makes two congruent segments. All right, so I've discussed that one. I'll check that off on my list. And the last one that I need to discuss is segment PS and RQ being congruent. And I knew those two were congruent because it was given to us that they were congruent to each other. So that's my favorite reason in every geometry proof, that it's given. So now I've discussed in writing these three pairs of congruent sides. That tells me that the two triangles have to be congruent by virtue of side, side, side. And I'm going to go ahead and cite statement 2, 4, and 5, which are the statements where I discuss those three pairs of congruent sides. All right, as always, I'm going to have you take a minute and in your own words summarize the key takeaways that you need to recall from the video. And then once you've done that, see what you can do with 2 and 3 on the following page, remembering, mark, and utilize your diagrams in order to come up with a game plan for your proof.